The Coal Giant. Prologue. The Cathedral of Steel. Belfast, Northern Ireland. May 31st, 1911. The noise was the first thing you noticed. It was not a single sound, but a geological rumble that vibrated to the soles of your boots and settled deep in your chest. It was the sound of Harland and Wolfe Shipyard, the beating industrial heart of the British Empire, waking up. On this morning, the sky over Belfast was a bruising shade of slate gray, threatening rain that never quite fell. The air tasted of coal smoke, wet wool, and the metallic tang of iron filings. Beneath the massive gantry cranes, known locally as Samson and Goliath, stood a wall of steel so high it seemed to blot out the sun. This was hull number 401. The world would know her as Titanic. She was not yet a ship. She was a hollow, steel husk, a man-made mountain resting on greased wooden slipways. She weighed 26,000 tons in her current state, a dead weight held in place by hydraulic triggers and the prayers of 15,000 Irish workmen. Down in the mud of Lagan River, James Doherty, a 42-year-old riveter, wiped a smear of grease from his forehead with a rag that was blacker than the coal smoke. His hands were leather tough, scarred from a decade of catching red-hot rivets thrown by the heater boys. He looked up at the black hull towering above him. To James, she wasn't a luxury liner. She was a paycheck. She was bread on the table for his 3 daughters. But even he, a man hardened by the brutal reality of the shipyards, felt a shiver of awe. She's a big bastard, isn't she, Jem? A younger worker shouted over the din of the hammers. James nodded, spitting into the muck. Big enough to challenge God, he muttered, though he crossed himself instinctively after saying it. High above them, on a specially constructed viewing platform, the chaotic mud of the yard gave way to silk top hats and the smell of expensive cigars. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a man of distinct, sharp features and a mustache that twitched with nervous energy. He was looking at the ship, but he was seeing numbers. He was seeing the transatlantic dominance over his rival, Cunard. He was seeing the Olympic-class liners ferrying millionaires and immigrants alike, a conveyor belt of commerce between the old world and the new. She is perfect, Thomas, Ismay said, his voice clipped and aristocratic. Next to him stood Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer. Andrews was different from the other executives. He wore a fine suit, but his pockets were often filled with grease-stained notes, and he knew the names of the men working down in the keel. He looked at the ship with the critical eye of a parent. He knew every bolt, every beam, every stress point. She is big, Bruce, Andrews corrected gently. Perfection is a process. She still needs her heart. She needs her engines. At 12:13 p.m., a red flag was raised. A hush fell over a crowd of 100,000 spectators who had gathered on the banks of the Lagan. The silence was heavy, unnatural for a city defined by noise. A foreman blew a whistle. It shrieked like a wounded bird. Under the hull, the hydraulic triggers were released. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The friction of 26,000 tons of steel fought against gravity. Then, a groan, a low, tearing sound wood against wood. The gathered crowd gasped as the Black Mountain began to move. It gathered speed, sliding backward, faster and faster, the grease smoking from the heat of the friction. With a thunderous crash that shook the windows of houses a mile away, the Titanic hit the water. A massive displacement wave surged up the banks, soaking the boots of the cheering workers. The hull bobbed, settling into the river with a heavy, graceful roll. She floated. Thomas Andrews let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He watched the tugboat swarm around the hull like gnats around a whale, preparing to drag her to the fitting-out wharf. The difficult part, the building, was over. Now began the year-long task of turning a steel shell into a floating palace. Andrews didn't know it then, watching the gray water swirl around the rudder, but he had less than a year to live. The clock had already started ticking.